a recap from last week's sermon with Pastor Jessica and the encounter with Nicodemus, and how overthinking and having too much information isn't always the best. I needed to hear that myself because I nuke everything. And what grabbed my heart was, we don't have to stay where we have always been when we are spiritually reborn. And that looking at Jesus is the answer. I'm sure most of you guys are probably aware that this is not very natural for me. I am an introvert to my core, with everything within me. Exactly. There's some people in this room right now that for the next 35, 40 minutes, these are going to be the most words that you've ever heard me say in the last 2 years that I've been here. But God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. So here I am. Which brings us into this sermon series, in this encounter with Jesus, in Mark 2, 1 through 12, where Jesus forgives and heals a paralyzed man. This encounter is also referenced in Matthew chapter 9 and Luke chapter 5. But let's read along verses 1 through 3. They're up on the screen. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by four of them. The significance of Capernaum, where he says he's going home. It's believed that he's going to the home of Simon Peter. This is early in Jesus' ministry, and this is a fishing village that is north of Galilee. Who has a best friend that you are so close with when you visit them that their home is your home? That is how Jesus is in Capernaum with Simon Peter. And another thing to point out is that nothing definite can be said about the nature of why or how that the man was paralyzed or why he couldn't walk. Verses 4 through 5. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then lowered the mat that the man was lying on. Now back to last week about asking too many questions. I've got questions immediately. Are we sending someone through the roof? But painting the picture of the roof, if we'll go to the next slide with the picture, that's kind of what I believe that the roof was to look like. Accessible by outside stairs, the roof was made of thick layer, clay, branches, and wood beams. And I've got previous firefighting experience, and I've cut through many of roofs. And I can't think of too many people that I'd want to send through a modern day roof. No, but the other question is did these men bring their tools with them? Where were they at? How far did they carry this man? Who knows? But that leads me into some questions about what kind of friend are you? What type of characteristics are being presented by the four friends?
Wow.
Are you bold, courageous, a risk taker? You're about to drop your friend in on Jesus as he's preaching. Where's the safety guy at? Yeah, you probably should. That's a little sketch. We probably should do something. When we are flat out on the mat, are we willing to be carried, take help, get to healing? Or are we hindering our own healing by refusing help or to be carried?
Wow. Wow.
Being carried requires vulnerability and courage.
Amen.
Verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." What Jesus says here is a direct statement and to the point. He's not questioning the man on the mat or his friends about how or why he got there. Jesus saw the faith of his friends. Sometimes we must be willing to be carried, and sometimes the faith of others will lift us up and take us to a place of healing.
Yes. That's right.
And the most important thing in that verse is that Jesus first met the man's most desperate need, and that is forgiveness. Not everyone's illness is a result of sin. There are other times Jesus heals first, forgives later, and other times he just heals. Jesus meets us right where we are with our greatest need first. Was this man's faith hindered by shame? Did he think he wasn't worthy of healing? Is that why Jesus forgives him first? So many things can keep us from seeking Jesus for healing. But don't let shame get between you and Jesus. Because remember, he sees you, he knows you, and he loves you. So what leads me into my first couple of questions this morning. When have you been flat on your back? Or when have you seen someone flat on their back? And that second part of that question is we should probably raise our hands for seeing someone flat on their back for these past couple of weeks. My second question is, what sacrifices are we willing to make to get our friends to the feet of Jesus? Let's read along verses 6 and 7. Now some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" I had to do a little research about what blaspheming meant because that is not in my everyday vocabulary. But the Greek version, blaspheme means to speak evil of. Hebrew, provocation. Speak evil of and provoke. Here's the key point to that. They didn't say any of those things out loud. God knows your heart, even when you don't verbally say something out loud.
That's right.
How often do we get stuck in a negative thought cycle about something we think God is or is not doing? We put distance between us and God that he never intended to be there because we are thinking something we won't actually say. But let's continue in verses 8 and 9 and see how this plays out. Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up, take your mat, and walk'?" Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's go to the perspective of us being the teachers of the law or the scribes. God doesn't get upset with our questions. When we don't understand what God is doing, ask the question rather than assume. It's easy to be in the moment and not understand what God is doing, rather than having that honest question and ask, what is going on? We cut ourselves short when we make assumptions. It's easy to be complacent and keep doing the easy thing, or we've always done it this way, rather than ask the tough questions about why and learn. We shunt other people's path to healing when we already have it made up in our hearts and in our minds. And an example of that could be, we don't look alike. My sin is different than his sin. X, Y, Z. You could fill in the blank. We'll go to verses 10 and 12. But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. Got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. The paralytic's healing authenticated Jesus' declaration of the man's forgiveness. Jesus' primary purpose is to bring forgiveness and mercy to sinners. As a matter of fact, not only was it why he put on flesh and walked among us, it's why he sacrificed that flesh to die for us, so we could be forgiven. You're probably sitting there right now thinking, wow, we just went through 12 verses awful fast. And in some ways we did. But I'm about to invite you into a space with me that I have never really let anyone in before. That I've always kind of put up a restriction on. I never let anyone in. But before we get there, while preparing for this sermon, one of my daily verses on the Bible app, it got me. It got me in a good way, too. It was confirmation that this sermon was supposed to happen this week. In Proverbs 12:25 through 26, it says, anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. The righteous choose their friends carefully, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. I've been under quite the spiritual attack under this past week. Being in my own head, thinking to myself, what makes me qualified to be up here? Why am I up here? Like, I don't need to be up here. There's got to be another person that can be up here for me right now. And thankfully, I didn't give in to those thoughts, because God did call me into ministry. And let me explain to you why this encounter is so important to me. I'm going to use my testimony to go step by step on why this encounter is so significant. I've struggled with a lot of things in my life. Still do. But the one thing that I ever had trouble giving over to God is my struggles with alcohol. And that is something that has haunted me for a long time and it's had control. Yeah. 26 years old. How long has it had control over me? You're probably thinking, you're not old enough for that. Let me paint a little bit of a picture for you. The first time that I can remember drinking alcohol, is when I was approximately 11. Now, I didn't drink every day when I was 11, but that's where it started. And as I grew older, early teens, mid-teens, late teens, early 20s, and all the different family and emotional trauma that I've ever gone through in my life, I used alcohol as a crutch, as a coping mechanism to escape myself, escape reality. I knew at about 18 or 19 years old that I had a drinking problem. I just liked it more than other people, and I knew that. I was hiding my drinking problem from my drinking friends. I was always told, you'll grow out of it. I didn't grow out of it. I grew into it. I grew deeper into it, where it's had me. And I wasn't equipped with the right people in my life to help me with that problem. Every relationship I had with friends and family, the lack of better terms, it was a dumpster fire. Everything I touched was bad. But the people who really knew me. And what I'm trying to say in that aspect of it, I also hid it really well. I started working as an EMT and later on to being a paramedic. And that was some of the greatest moments of my life. I truly cherished and thankful for that job. But let me put into a little bit of perspective of some things. Most people in their lives, give or take in either direction, will encounter 10 true traumatic events in their whole life. And I was doing that monthly with encountering with others. And I knew what I was getting myself into. What's important to note here is that all that trauma of my own well-being, I ran from. I know. I ran from it all. I always wanted to help others. But at the end of the day, I was at a point where I couldn't even help myself. I feared reaching out and saying, hey, I've got a problem because of that stigma. And at times, I believed that and thought it was the truth. Because I had several members in leadership about where I used to work at say, if you can't make ambulance calls, you have no business being here. So I hid it and kept tucking it away. My breaking point for that career was COVID. In that, COVID was a rough time in the healthcare community. It was a rough time for everyone as a whole. But I was significantly in poor health. I was 260 pounds. I had $350,000 in debt. I had all the nice things, nice car. I had everything that you could think of. I had all of those things. And I was still running from my past. never addressing it, never dealing with it, never letting anybody in to help me. And the Navy was a way out for me. It allowed me the quickest way to run. And I ran as far as I could from where I was. But what's the problem with running?
We're there too.
You don't. It follows you wherever you go until you deal with it. I remember lying on a beach in San Diego. You know, beach shirt on, the nice hat, sunglasses, you know, living the dream. And I was so severely hungover from the night before, laying out in the sun. And my wife looking at me. And she looked at me right square in the eyes and said, "You have a problem. And if you don't do something about it, it's going to kill you." And that scared me. Because it was the first time that I ever really believed that my wife was going to leave me. So we move on from that. Things got a little bit better over time. Wasn't drinking all the time. I would have I accepted that I was going to try to do it by myself. You know, I'm going to do sobriety by myself on my own terms when I want to do it. And I was successful at it for about 30 to 45 days at a time. And after I'd hit a certain point, I would think to myself, I can reward myself. I'm not drinking every day like I used to. Thought I was doing good. But every time I let that back in, it got worse and worse and worse. The recovery got worse. Then we PCS'd up here to Indian Head, to a place on paper that I was probably never supposed to be at. I work at Andrews, and I commute every day. They didn't have housing available at the time. They said, "Hey, you can go down here to Indian Head. We'll get you in some housing down there." I was like, "Okay." I didn't know a thing about Indian Head. But we did it. And whenever we were driving that U-Haul down 210, thinking that everyone was going to kill us on the way here, we looked out and saw the sign for Bridge Church. We were like, 72 hours later, we were in here.
Wow.
And here we are.
Praise God.
Praise God. So that was kind of the before. That kind of paints the picture to where we are currently. And honestly, it would take weeks and months to paint the full picture. But where we are at today, the last time that I had went home to Arkansas, I went home for some family medical stuff. And I was alone. I was away. And I had the opportunity to let it slip back into my life. And I lied about it to my wife. I lied to her about how much I was not in control. At this point, I was already a ministry student, pretending that I had sobriety handled. And because of my unwillingness to let others in, I failed. And I deeply wounded my marriage in the process. But God, grace, and some friends willing to carry my mat. I was terrified to bring it up to Pastor Jen or Pastor Rick. I was sweating. I had like a whole 24 hours to prepare myself for this too. So naturally, my mind is racing about everything that could possibly go wrong when I tell them. I was so shameful. And all that fear and guilt was immediately deflected by the endless amount of love, grace, and accountability I had moving forward.
Amen. That's right.
So how many times do we let shame get in the way of healing? The response to all of this is that my wife, David Lamb, Rick Legacy, Joe Clements, they picked up every edge of my mat and carried me. In the midst of all of that, I had to tell my chain of command too. So that fear was lurking in my life. All that stigma I had about when I was with the ambulance service, about not wanting to seek help, that carries over pretty comparable to the military world. But I did. I went out on a limb, and I walked into my chief's office. And I said, hey, here's what's going on. And I was immediately accepted. No questions asked. And I had help within a week.
Wow. Praise God.
My true and honest sobriety date is February the 7th, 2024. That is 115 days ago. And it all started with just being vulnerable and courageous. The one thing that sobriety, the many things that sobriety has taught me, is how to be honest with myself. And that there is a level of ownership that I have to take for the actions that occurred. Yes, some of the things that happened to me in my life was not very fair. But at the end of the day, I am in control of how I act and how I respond. And thankfully, being vulnerable and giving that part of my life over to God immediately was immediate relief.
Amen.
So that's kind of the beginning, middle, as we start working our way down. I feel really obligated to share this aspect too. I was 19 days into being sober. And I was one of the first times that I ever felt like I was in a good headspace. Where, yeah, it was 19 days, but I had so much support that I was like, I'm good. Not good, but better than where I've been. And I had a training detachment come up where I needed to go to paint school in Norfolk, Virginia. And anyone who knows what TAD or TDY, that's one big party, usually. But I wasn't really worried about that aspect of it. You know, like I said, I was in a good space until my best friend in the whole entire world was going to be TAD to Yorktown, Virginia at the same time that I was. Now, this isn't a friend that I acquired in the last 6 months. Isn't a friend that I met at a bar. This is a friend that knows me in and out and has known me since we could walk. And I'm not in the business of calling people out, but he's walked with me in all these hard times throughout my life. And we share a lot of the same story. So both of us together It's a little scary when you're 19 days sober. And I had my support group with me, and I was telling them everything that was going on. I was like, look, I don't know if I can do this. If there's one thing that I'm going to fail my sobriety over, this is a top priority. This is up here. They were like, you need to go see him. I was like, I want to, but I'm scared. Go see him. Okay, you're all right, I'm going. So that whole way over there from Norfolk to Yorktown, it's quite the haul depending on what side of the bridge you're on, or the side of the tunnel you're on. But I get over there, my knuckles are clenched the whole way over there, sweating, racing, my mind's racing. Like, I have to worry. I'm worrying about things that I know are irrational in the back of my brain. But I'm wondering about this lifelong friendship that I've had. Is it going to be different now that I don't drink? So I get there, I pick him up, give him a hug. I was like, yeah, man, it's so good to see you and all these things. We get in the car. Before I put that car in park, I looked at him right square in the eye. And that is something that is really hard for me to do, being an introvert. But I looked at him. I said, I'm an alcoholic. I'm 19 days sober. I'm scared. I don't know if I can go through with this. He was like, what? So I was just like, and I slowed down and told him. And he looked at me and said, I'm so proud of you. You did it. I'm trying to quit too. Whew. There was about 25,000 pounds that was immediately lifted off of my chest because I didn't have to worry or fear anymore. In the midst of all of this, I had my 4 people carry my mat. And I had my buddy completely pick up my mat and throw it as far as he could. Positive. Just like we had never left. We never skipped a beat. Instead of me wondering if he will carry my mat, I realized that Jesus is reaching through me to carry his. And it's crazy to me how God will use our brokenness to bring healing to others. Healing is extremely hard, but it is necessary. And I wouldn't be where I'm at today if it wasn't for the most rock-solid community support that I have in my corner. And this isn't all me doing this either. This is what happens when you give that over to God.
That's right.
Because I couldn't do sobriety on my own. It's better to have 4 quality friends than rather than having 100. 4 quarters rather than 100 pennies. That's a cheesy line. But it's so true. And if I would have understood quality over quantity, I probably never would have gotten into the situation with alcohol to begin with. You don't have to do it alone.
That's right.
You could substitute my struggle with alcohol and plug in your struggle. Sometimes the Big C church is really easy about throwing the book at you and telling you to live your life by it. And I think that we could all probably agree to some extent that that's pretty solid advice. We should do that. But how do you do that when you're broken? I think we do it pretty good here at Bridge, with Bridge Builder groups.
Me too.
I just want to reiterate, I didn't do this. God did this. The bottom line for today is we are all led to a crisis of belief at some point in our lives, sometimes more than once. But we must not throw rocks at the people who are willing to help us out. Allow yourself to be courageous and vulnerable and heal. And that's why I keep coming back, and thanks for letting me share.